Chapter 19. Taxes on Real Property. Who may claim a homeowner grant? The owner-occupier of a property. Which of the following factors is generally not considered in determining whether or not profit, realized on the sale of a property 18 months after it was purchased, is treated as business income rather than a capital gain for taxation purposes? The nature of the buyer who purchased the property. Which of the following real estate purchases is most likely to be a violation of the Prohibition on the Purchase of Residential Property by Non-Canadians Act? Mario, an American citizen, purchases a townhouse which he plans to rent to a Canadian citizen. In which of the following scenarios would the profit, or capital gain, realized upon the sale of property be most likely to be completely exempt from taxation? The seller purchased the property to live in as their principal residence and lived on the property for 10 years. A complaint against the amount of a real property assessment might proceed through hearings by the 4 different bodies listed below. The order of these hearings would be: 1. Property Assessment Review Panels. 2. Property Assessment Appeal Board. 3. Supreme Court of British Columbia. 4. Court of Appeal. Which of the following statements is false regarding GST? Transactions will only be subject to GST if they are expressly listed in the legislation as a transaction for which GST applies. Which one of the following statutes affects the real property taxation system in British Columbia? The School Act. Which of the following would likely not fall under the definition of a residential complex under the Excise Tax Act? A home that is used for short-term rentals on Airbnb. Whose responsibility is it under the Assessment Act to establish actual value? The assessor. Which one of the following occupiers of real property would not be liable, by statute, for the real property taxes? The registered holder of a long-term lease, where the lessor is not a tax-exempt organization or a public body. Yam was the owner of an office building in downtown Vancouver. She recently sold the building to Ashley for $100 million. Ashley did not pay the GST on the sale, and Yang has just received an assessment for the GST due on the sale of the property from the Canada Revenue Agency, CRA, worth $5 million. Which of the following statements is false? If Yang files an objection and it is affirmed by an appeals officer at the CRA, Yang has exhausted her options in terms of appealing the assessment. Which one of the following factors would make a property owner eligible to apply for deferral of real property taxes under the regular program? The property owner is a widower. In which of the following scenarios would the City of Vancouver's empty homes tax most likely apply? The owner spends the summer, from June to August, living in the property as a principal residence. For the remainder of the year, she lists the property on Airbnb, exclusively for weekend trips. She does not have a hotel or Band B license. What is an assessment notice? A notice that informs the property owner of the actual value of their property. If a property owner considers that the actual value assessment of their property is too high, they must first submit their complaint to a property assessment review panel. In establishing the actual value of a residential property for tax assessment purposes, the assessor may consider: 1. The present use of the property. 2. The location of the property. 3. The rental value of the property. Correct answer: all above. Which one of the following real properties must be assessed at market value for purposes of real property taxation? Residences owned by elected government officials. Helen is the owner and occupier of a detached 2-bedroom house in Vancouver. Which of the following statements regarding property taxes on Helen's property is false? The Assessment Act is the sole source of statute law governing taxation of real property in British Columbia. Jennifer Joseph has lived alone in an apartment since the death of her husband 10 years ago. She has just turned 60 years of age, retired from her job as a bus driver, and wants to begin gardening as a hobby to fill in her retirement years. She has found a small house that is selling at a price she can afford because it is the only residential property in an area of commercial development. The present owners, who are anxious to sell, have lived in the house for about 20 years and have developed a magnificent garden, which appeals very much to Mrs. Joseph. However, she is worried about having enough retirement income to meet the mortgage payments and the property tax payments if she uses all of her savings as a down payment. Which one of the following statements is true? Mrs. Joseph may make an application to defer payment of the net property tax under the regular program for as many years as she owns and resides in the house. Which of the following statements is true regarding GST in a transaction for the sale of real estate? GST generally does not apply to the amount of the deposit until the closing date. In British Columbia's real property taxation system, the actual value of a property is the value shown on the assessment notice. Which of the following statements is false regarding the seller's obligations surrounding GST in a transaction for the sale of real estate? If the seller receives an assessment from the Canada Revenue Agency for the amount of the GST after failing to collect it from the buyer, the seller has lost their ability to pursue the buyer for the amount of the tax and will be held fully liable for the amount. When can an appeal be made to the Supreme Court of British Columbia regarding a real property assessment value? After receipt of the property assessment appeal board decision, and then only on a point of law.